As long as your mind keeps screaming, you will never hear what your soul is trying to say and reveal about your purpose. And if you stay until the end, what seems like confusion today may begin, for the first time, to reveal the real thread of your purpose. You are not without purpose. You are buried under too many voices. The voice of urgency, the voice of fear, the voice of comparison, the voice of lack, the voice of needing to prove your worth, the voice of the past accusing you, the voice of the future threatening you. And in the middle of this entire tribunal, you still want to hear the truth? You won't hear it. Because purpose is not born in turmoil. Purpose is not born in a panicked mind. Purpose does not reveal itself to someone who cannot sit for a single minute without running away from themselves. What you call, "I don't know what to do with my life," is often just the result of years spent living far from your center. I say this without distance because I have seen this mechanism from the inside. The mind manufactures false urgencies so you never face the real question. It offers you 1,000 paths, but no silence. It gives you goals, but no ground. It gives you distraction, but no truth. And for a long time, a person thinks they are searching for meaning, when in reality they are only changing the noise. They change goals, change desires, change environments, change promises, change images, change masks. But they remain the same, because the root has not been touched, and the root is always the same. You cannot hear your own life because your mind has taken the place of your soul. In the vision of Rumi and the Sufi tradition, the human path is not to inflate the self, but to leave the prison of the separate self and walk toward the truth of God through love, remembrance, and inner transformation. The center of life, then, is not to become more important, but to become more truthful before the real. That is why, in this horizon, purpose is not first career, applause, or social identity. Purpose is return, alignment, union, sincerity of being. And here begins the part that truly confronts. Your mind does not want your purpose. Your mind wants safety, image, approval, control, and guarantees. But real purpose almost never arrives first as a guarantee. It arrives as a clean discomfort, as a simple truth, as a calling that dismantles your characters. In Sufi vocabulary, there is the idea of the nafs, the lower self, the raw self, the self driven by desire, fear, vanity, and impulse. An essential part of spiritual work in this tradition is precisely to educate and weaken this dominating self so it no longer governs life. That is why so many people spend years asking, "What is my purpose?" and remain in the dark. Because the question comes from the wrong place. It comes from the part that wants to be admired, from the part that wants to feel special, from the part that wants a grand mission so it does not have to admit its own fragility. But Rumi does not treat the ego as a reliable guide. On the contrary, in his work, he treats it as the great inner idol, the false center to which a person bows without realizing it. So understand the violence of this truth. Perhaps you are not lost because life hid your purpose from you. Perhaps you are lost because you are still worshiping what you feel, think, and want at the most superficial level of yourself. When you begin to silence the mind, the first thing that appears is not light. It is accumulated noise, old sadness, poorly digested anger, the fear of being no one, the shame of admitting that much of what you call a dream was only a hunger for validation. And this is exactly where almost everyone runs away, because they would rather remain noisy than encounter themselves without decoration. But without this crossing, there is no real purpose, only sophisticated distraction. At the heart of Sufism, the human center is not the discursive mind, but the spiritual heart, the qalb. In Islamic tradition, the heart is understood as the center of the being, the place of knowledge, love, perception, and inner transformation. In Sufism, it is precisely the point of passage between the human and the divine. That is why the problem has never been simply thinking too much. The problem is living so captured by the surface that the heart loses its voice. That is why silencing the mind on this path does not mean extinguishing intelligence. It means removing from the throne what was never meant to rule everything. It means stopping consulting fear as if it were wisdom. It means stopping treating anxiety as intuition. It means stopping calling compulsion purpose. It means returning the governance of life to the cleanest center. And that center does not shout. That center does not advertise itself. That center does not beg for attention. That center knows, but it speaks too softly for those who have become enslaved to excess. Sufi practice insists on the remembrance of God, dhikr, which means precisely that: remembrance, recollection, conscious return. It is not an empty technique to feel good. It is a way of breaking the forgetfulness that has taken over the being. And when forgetfulness diminishes, a person stops living only on the surface and begins to rediscover the center. Purpose then ceases to seem like an external enigma and begins to emerge as inner fidelity. Rumi insists that there are realities language cannot exhaust. In classical translations of the Masnavi, he shows that love exceeds explanation and that speech cannot reach everything that is most true. This matters here because your deepest purpose may not be something you will first figure out. It may be something you will recognize when the noise falls. First, as a weight that lifts. Then, as a truth that needs no spectacle. Then, as a direction that hurts and relieves at the same time. And pay attention to this, because almost no one tells you this clearly. True purpose rarely feeds the character you built to survive. On the contrary, it usually humbles that character. If your entire life was constructed to appear strong, purpose may call you to honesty. If you live to be admired, purpose may call you to fertile anonymity. If you live to please, purpose may call you to a truth that will disappoint many people. If you live to run, purpose may call you to stop. And you call this failure, when in fact it may be the first time your life is no longer lying. I know how this tears you open, because when silence truly begins to act, it does not hand you a beautiful map. It removes your anesthetics. You realize how addicted you were to stimulation, how much you needed to stay busy in order not to feel, how much you confused movement with direction, how much you depended on the gaze of others to know who you were. Silence, when it goes deep, disorganizes you before it aligns you. And only those who can endure this apparent chaos begin to hear something truer than their own fear. In the Sufi horizon, this dying of the false self is part of the crossing. The classical language speaks of fana, the dissolution of the illusory self, and baka, remaining in what is more real before God. In simple terms, when the false center loses strength, something more real can remain. That is why purpose does not appear in full to the dominating ego. It appears when the tyranny of the ego begins to yield. So don't just tell me you want to discover your purpose. First ask whether you can endure losing the lies you have been using to sustain yourself. Because perhaps your greatest problem has never been a lack of direction. Perhaps it has been an attachment to fantasy, the fantasy of who you should be, the fantasy of how your life should look, the fantasy that purpose is always something grand, visible, special, impressive. Sometimes purpose begins in a way that is almost offensive to the ego, telling the truth, asking for forgiveness, getting sober, serving sincerely, being faithful to what is clean, doing what is real even without applause. Rumi gained spiritual and poetic authority precisely because his work was born from the experience of love, loss, search, transformation, and the inner crossing that marked his life, especially after his encounter with Shams of Tabriz. His poetry is not cold theory about self-discovery. It springs from a life struck by rupture, spiritual passion, and radical reorientation of being. That is why, when he points toward love and the transformation of the self, he is not decorating pain, he is passing through it to the center. And here may be the truth you least wanted to hear and most needed. Your true purpose in this life does not begin when you find the perfect activity. It begins when you stop running from what in you needs to be purified, because a noisy mind will always want a purpose that exalts it, but an awakened soul wants a purpose that aligns it. The mind asks, how do I win? The heart asks, how do I return to what is true? The mind asks, how do I secure myself? The heart asks, what must I surrender to so I do not keep losing myself? And the answer to that second question changes everything. So when you sit in silence, do not first ask for success, signs, confirmation, or destiny. Look at what within you is still noisy, hungry, agitated, wounded, theatrical. Look without makeup. Look without false poetry. Look without pretending you already understand. Because perhaps the beginning of your purpose is hidden exactly in the place you avoid touching. Perhaps it is in the pain you rush to silence. Perhaps it is in the simple truth you keep postponing. Perhaps it is in the call to return to the center before returning to the world. And if everything in you trembles when silence approaches, then the question is no longer whether you have a purpose. The question is why so much noise was necessary to prevent you from hearing it. And what exactly in you is still terrified of finally listening. And what terrifies you most about silence is not the silence itself. It is what it exposes. Because the moment the noise fades, you begin to realize that much of what you defended as my dream may never have been your soul speaking. Maybe it was fear of being small. Maybe it was a hunger to be seen. Maybe it was the desperation to finally be worth something in someone else's eyes. And that hurts because it touches your dignity. It hurts to admit that you spent entire pieces of your life chasing goals that healed nothing. It hurts to admit that you called it purpose when it was only distracting you from the question that truly mattered, who you became while you were desperately trying to become someone. Rumi does not construct the spiritual path as a project of self-aggrandizement. He is remembered as one of the greatest masters of Sufism precisely because his entire work revolves around inner transformation through love, through the remembrance of God, and through the loss of the false center of the self, and his life's turning point was deeply marked by his encounter with Shams of Tabriz. This matters because in Rumi's universe, the true center of life is not the social character. It is the soul in relationship with the real. So stop expecting your purpose to appear as a reward for your character, because that is the mistake. You still think that discovering your purpose is receiving a kind of inner coronation, as if life were finally going to tell you, yes, you are special. Yes, you are different. Yes, now you have a grand mission. But what often happens is the opposite. Purpose comes first as pruning, as a loss of taste for certain masks, as fatigue with what once excited you, as shame in continuing to live by appearances, as a cleaner, quieter, more serious hunger. It is not inflation, it is purification. In Islamic and Sufi tradition, the nafs is the self that, when disordered, pulls a person toward raw desire, impulse, vanity, and self-deception. The qalb, the heart, is treated as the inner center of the being, the place of perception, love, knowledge, and spiritual orientation. That is why the inner struggle is not a war against the mind as a tool, but against the domination of the confused self over the whole of life. When the nafs rules everything, even the search for purpose becomes vanity. When the heart regains its voice, life begins to align. And I will tell you bluntly, as long as you are in love with your agitation, you will not find your purpose. Because agitation gives you a false sense of importance. It makes you feel in motion. It makes you feel necessary. It makes you feel in control. But that agitation is often an elegant escape. You are not living intensely. You are avoiding depth. You are not full of plans. You are afraid to listen. You are not being productive. You are being chased from within. And whoever is chased from within turns any noise into company. That is why silencing the mind is not about sitting down and stopping thoughts, as if it were some naive magic trick. In the Sufi horizon, practices like dhikr, the remembrance of God, exist to pull a person out of forgetfulness, of themselves and of the divine. It is not spiritual entertainment, it is return, it is reorientation, it is awakening from numbness. And when that return begins, a person starts to realize that what they called I was a bundle of reflexes, fears, and repetitions. Now look at your own life without escaping. When you become silent, what rises first? Anxiety, fantasy, guilt, neediness, the urge to grab your phone, the urge to plan 20 futures, the urge to prove something? Exactly. That is already showing you where your purpose is being hijacked, because purpose does not bloom in soil dominated by compulsion. First, the soil must be cleared. First, the heart must breathe. First, a person must stop obeying every impulse as if every impulse were truth. Not everything that moves you comes from the soul. Much of it comes simply from the fear of stopping. And here, there is a decisive difference that few people understand. The voice of the soul does not usually have the same texture as the voice of anxiety. Anxiety tightens, accelerates, demands, threatens, dramatizes. It speaks like someone always on the verge of losing everything. The deeper voice, even when it confronts you, carries a different weight. It does not need panic to be serious. It does not need to shout to be true. It may call you to something difficult, but it does not push you in desperation. It calls you with a clean firmness. And if you have never trained silence, you will mistake pressure for direction. In Sufism, inner purification is not religious ornament, it is a condition for vision. The tradition speaks of working on the heart because a heart taken over by pride, attachment, resentment, and excess ego loses spiritual clarity. That is why what some authors called a science of the hearts emerged early on, precisely to care for this inner center. In simple terms, if the center is sick, the reading of life becomes sick as well, and a person who is inwardly unwell may call purpose something that only feeds their own illness. So what you call today, I don't know my purpose, may be, in part, an inability to endure inner cleansing. Because finding purpose is not only receiving direction, it is losing illusion. It is looking at desires that dominated you and realizing that many of them were borrowed. They were desires of family, desires of culture, desires of trauma, desires of comparison, desires of a wound trying to become identity. And when those desires begin to fall away, it creates a strange feeling of death, because along with them falls the image you used to exist. But perhaps that feeling of death is the beginning of the most honest life you have ever touched. That is why the ideas of fana and baqa are so profound in the Sufi path. Fana points to the dissolution of the false self, and baqa to remaining in what is more real before God. It is not an empty annihilation of the person, but the scoot of the illusory center, so that something truer can remain. When you understand this, you realize that silencing the mind is not destroying yourself. It is allowing what prevents you from truly living to die. And I know this confronts you because it destroys the ego's most cherished fantasy, that you will find your purpose without having to lose anything. You won't. You will lose noise. You will lose mental addictions. You will lose certain false passions. You will lose the need to appear as something. You will lose certain urgencies that gave you adrenaline. You will lose pieces of an identity that kept you busy but empty. And that is exactly why so many people prefer to remain confused, because confusion preserves the character. Truth wounds it. But there comes a moment when the soul grows tired of being suffocated. And when that moment arrives, the whole world loses a bit of its old taste. You keep doing the same things outwardly, but inwardly you can no longer lie with the same ease. What once seemed important now feels hollow. What once distracted you now exhausts you. What once excited you now embarrasses you. And you call this a crisis, when it may be mercy. It may be the beginning of the rupture between your real life and your performed life. It may be the beginning of silence coming to demand truth. So let me ask you, without softening anything, if all the noise were stripped away today, what would remain of you? If the pressures, the masks, the expectations, the imagined applause, the repeated fears, the comparisons, and the roles you perform were removed, what would remain at the center? Because it is from that living, naked, untheatrical remainder that purpose begins to be born, and almost no one wants to arrive there, because there is no audience, no pose, no excuse. There is only you before what is real, and that is precisely why almost every mind runs away, while the soul continues waiting in silence for the moment when you finally stop running and dare to listen to what it has been trying to tell you for a long time, and what it will force you to face when you realize that it is not only the purpose of your life that is at stake, but the truth of what you have become while you were fleeing from it. Because when the soul truly speaks, it almost never arrives in the way your anxiety wanted. It does not come flattering you. It does not come promising immediate greatness. It does not come telling you that you will be admired, envied, applauded, or finally placed above others. The soul arrives cleaner and harsher. It reveals, it cuts, it simplifies, it shows what is false, what is excess, what is theater, what is attachment, what is escape. And that is why so many people say they want truth, but run the moment truth begins to touch their own life. Because truth does not massage the character, it exposes it. That is when you begin to perceive the difference between two voices within you that seem similar, but are not. The voice of anxiety always comes filled with urgency, tightness, threat, and confusion. It wants answers now, certainty now, relief now, direction now. It throws you forward as if you were always late for your own salvation. The deeper voice does not work like that. It may call you to something very difficult, but it does not arrive hysterical. It has weight, not desperation. It has firmness, not panic. It has truth, not pressure. And if you have never cleansed your interior, you will continue to call anxiety intuition and fear a calling. In the horizon of Sufism, this makes complete sense because the spiritual path is not treated as emotional entertainment, but as purification of the human center. The heart, the kalb, is seen as the center of the being, and the tradition also speaks of working on the nafs, this disordered self that can pull a person toward vanity, impulse, attachment, and self-deception. When the heart is suffocated and the disordered self dominates, the reading of life becomes distorted, and a distorted reading always invents a distorted purpose. So understand the violence of this. Perhaps you are not without direction. Perhaps you are simply too full of yourself in the wrong way, full of reaction, full of fear, full of inherited opinions, full of desires that were never born in you, full of image, full of comparison, full of fantasy. And a person this full does not find purpose because they are already too busy worshipping their own noise. There is no space. There is no listening. There is no truth. There is only movement, only noise, only a life being pushed from within without ever touching the ground. And that is why silence hurts so much, because it does not immediately give you a beautiful vision of the future. First, it gives you contact with everything you have been avoiding. It shows the extent of your dependence on distraction. It shows how much you need agitation in order not to feel the void. It shows how much your mind has become a machine for manufacturing stimulation to prevent you from facing what is rotting at the center. And then you call silence emptiness, when often that emptiness is just the beginning of cleansing. Rumi carries this weight because he does not speak of decorative love or superficial spirituality. He was one of the great voices of Sufism, and his work revolves around inner transformation, divine love, and the crossing of the self into something more real. His life was also marked by a profound rupture linked to his encounter with Shams of Tabriz. So when you invoke Rumi as an authority, you are not stepping into a garden of beautiful phrases, but into a fire that wants to burn the false center of the human being. And here, you must make a brutal decision. Do you truly want to know your real purpose, or do you just want a beautiful idea that does not disturb your lies? Because discovering real purpose demands losing many things that currently give you a sense of identity. It demands losing the addiction to approval. It demands losing the character that lives to impress. It demands losing attachment to urgency. It demands losing desires that were born only to cover emptiness. It demands losing the need to feel special all the time, and almost no one wants to pay that price. Everyone wants meaning. Very few want purification. In the Sufi path, the remembrance of God, dhikr, does not appear as a decorative detail, but as a central practice of return. In simple terms, it is to remember, to recall, to return to the real, to return to the center, to leave forgetfulness. And this matters here because the human being loses direction, not only because they think too much, but because they forget where they should be living from. When forgetfulness dominates, any impulse feels like truth. When remembrance returns, much illusion loses its strength. That is why purpose is not first an intellectual answer. Purpose is often what begins to appear when you stop betraying what you already know deep down. You already know where you are lying. You already know where you are forcing yourself. You already know where you are diminishing yourself. You already know where you are living for an audience. You already know where you are saying yes out of fear. You already know where you are filling your schedule to avoid hearing your own conscience. The problem is that knowing deep down is not enough when the mind is trained to suppress. The mind runs, the heart knows, and your suffering grows precisely in the distance between those two. That is why a person feels a strange mixture of relief and terror when they begin to touch the truth. Relief because for the first time something real breathes. Terror because that real thing threatens everything that was false but comfortable. And then the inner war is born. One part wants to return to the old noise. Another part can no longer stand living that way. One part wants approval. Another wants truth. One part wants safety. Another wants wholeness. And in this conflict, you begin to understand that your crisis was not just confusion, it was a birth being prevented. In the classical language of Sufism, the idea of fana appears, the dissolution of the false self, and baqa, remaining in what is more real before God. In simple terms, something in you must die so that something truer can live. And that is exactly what the ego hates. It hates any process that removes it from the center. It prefers a confused life in which it still rules over a clear life in which it must kneel before the real. So do not be deceived by your own resistance. Sometimes you are not seeking purpose. Sometimes you are negotiating with the truth to see if you can find it without having to change. You cannot, because true purpose does not enter a house where falsehood still sits on the altar. It does not enter a life governed by fear, vanity, and noise without confronting these things. It enters by tearing the fabric of illusion. It enters forcing you to reconsider what you call success, love, courage, identity, destiny. And that is why finding purpose hurts more than repeating goals. I say this so directly because many people are trying to turn spirituality into anesthesia. They want to use silence to relax, not to see. They want to use Rumi to feel emotion, not to strip themselves bare. They want to use the idea of the soul to feel special, not to become true. But the real path does not offer that cheap comfort. The real path grabs you by the throat and asks, do you want to keep being shaped by fear? Or do you finally want to live from what is cleanest within you? And perhaps the most serious question now is not, what is my purpose? But what within me is still preventing me from hearing what is already being asked? Because perhaps the call began a long time ago. Perhaps it came as fatigue with the artificial. Perhaps it came as repeated pain. Perhaps it came as a loss of taste for what once seduced you. Perhaps it came as a silent shame at continuing to waste your own life. Perhaps it came as a thirst for truth. And if that is so, then what you call confusion may actually be the final layer of noise before the revelation of what you have always tried not to hear. And that becomes even more dangerous when you realize that it is not only your mind that must be silenced, but also the false loyalties that keep you bound to a life that no longer corresponds to what your soul has been trying to ask of you for a long time. And this is where false loyalties come in, because many people do not lose their purpose for lack of intelligence. They lose it through blind loyalty to what should never have governed their lives. Loyalty to the image their family expected, loyalty to the role they learned in order not to be rejected, loyalty to old pain, as if suffering were the only way to remain themselves, loyalty to neediness, loyalty to the need to please, loyalty to the fear of disappointing, loyalty to a version of themselves that was born to survive, not to live. And as long as you remain faithful to these chains, you will call a prison destiny. Because the cruelest part is this: you may even feel the call of the soul and still obey fear out of habit. You may even know, deep down, what you need to leave, what you need to face, what you need to say, what you need to stop pretending, and still continue betraying that truth in the name of some false peace. And that false peace is slow poison. It does not scream. It does not explode. It simply erases you little by little. It takes the light from your eyes. It dries out your courage. It turns your life into a sequence of gestures that are correct on the outside and empty on the inside. And then you begin to die without a funeral because you keep functioning, but you are no longer truly alive. In the Sufi tradition, inner work revolves precisely around remembering God, purifying the heart, and weakening the dominance of the disordered self. Dhikr is remembrance. The qalb is the heart as the inner center, and the nafs is the self that can stray through impulse, vanity, and attachment. So when this path speaks of return, it is not speaking of spiritual performance, but of leaving the captivity of the false self and returning to the truest center of being. So consider the gravity of this in your own life. Perhaps your greatest obstacle is not ignorance, but misplaced loyalty. Perhaps you have been serving something for years without realizing it, serving approval, serving comparison, serving status, serving fear, serving the need not to appear weak, serving the image of being a good person, serving the obligation to be useful all the time, serving old guilt. And if you serve all of this, how do you expect to hear the soul? The soul does not share a throne with these forces. The heart does not bloom in a house occupied by too many masters. Rumi carries such weight because his work does not revolve around crafting a more beautiful identity, but around shifting the being toward a more real center through love, remembrance, and inner transformation. He is remembered as one of the great Sufi poets and mystics, and the tradition itself links his life to a radical turning point after his encounter with Shams, not to a pursuit of external prestige. And this confronts you now in an almost unbearable way because it forces the question, whom is your life obeying when no one is watching? Not what you post, not what you say you believe, not what you wish were true about you. Whom does your life actually obey? Fear, urgency, the desire to be chosen, the need to control, the laziness of refusing to let the mask die. Because purpose is not born from what you say you love. Purpose is born from what truly governs your steps. Perhaps that is why silence feels so dangerous. Because in silence, the narrative falls, the excuses fall, the distractions fall, the inner theater that justified everything falls. And then, the secret alliances you made against yourself appear. The alliance of never displeasing anyone, even if it destroys you. The alliance of never slowing down, because if you stop, you will feel the void. The alliance of never being ordinary, because deep down, you believe that being ordinary means not deserving love. The alliance of carrying old wounds as identity, because without them, you would not even know who you are anymore. Do you see the horror? You may be protecting the very structure that is killing your truth. I speak this way because the mind creates a very seductive illusion. It tells you that one day you will find your purpose without having to break from anything, without losing anyone, without disappointing expectations, without feeling grief, without facing guilt, without enduring loneliness, without abandoning roles. But that almost never happens. Real purpose demands rupture, sometimes silent, sometimes visible, but always real, because it was not made to decorate your prison, it was made to pull you out of it. And here, you need to understand something with brutal clarity. Not every loyalty is love. Much loyalty is fear, disguised as virtue. You keep erasing yourself and call it kindness. You keep betraying yourself and call it maturity. You keep accepting what dries you out and call it responsibility. You keep suffocating your own soul and call it humility. But humility, on the real path, is not violating yourself to fit into what diminishes you. Humility is bowing to the real, not to other people's fear. It is leaving the false center, not abandoning the deepest truth of your being. In Sufism, the heart is seen as the center capable of knowing and loving, and an essential part of spiritual discipline is precisely to purify it from turbulence, selfishness, and hardness that blind it. In simple terms, when the heart is sick, a person loses the ability to read what is true. When it is polished by remembrance and sincerity, perception changes. So perhaps your next step is not to ask again, "What is my purpose?" but to ask, "What false loyalty am I still feeding every day?" Because the answer may be right in front of you, in the conversation you avoid, in the decision you postpone, in the environment that has already hurt you too much and you still call normal, in the role you have played for so long that you think it is you, in the anxiety you consult before every choice, in the guilt that still dictates your schedule, in the addiction to being needed so you do not have to be true. And notice how this changes everything, because now the discovery of purpose stops looking like an abstract hunt and becomes a surgery of loyalty. The question is no longer only, "Where am I going?" The question is, what must I untie myself from internally in order to finally go? Untie yourself from applause. Untie yourself from the fear of judgment. Untie yourself from the addiction to urgency. Untie yourself from the wounded character that wants to turn its own pain into an altar. Untie yourself from the image you learned to sell. Untie yourself even from the romantic idea of purpose, so that something cleaner, more naked, more true can remain. And perhaps that is why so many people come close to the truth and then retreat, because they realize the problem was never only a lack of direction. The problem was who they would have to stop being in order to live that direction. And this is the sharpest point of all. There is an identity within you that wants to keep living, even if your soul has to be suffocated for that to happen. There is a version of you that feeds on confusion, because in confusion, it still remains in control. And if you do not see this, you will spend your entire life asking for light while protecting your own shadow. So now, do not run from this question. Do not answer quickly. Do not answer beautifully. Do not answer as someone who wants to appear awakened. Answer with the raw courage of someone who is tired of betraying themselves. Whom is your life being faithful to today? And what exactly within you would have to die for your soul to finally breathe without asking permission? In the end, perhaps your true purpose was never far from you. Perhaps it was only buried beneath fear, noise, and the false loyalties that took over your life. And if this message touched something you have been trying not to face, write in the comments the phrase, "I need to hear my soul," because I want to know how far this message reached within you. Share it with someone who is also lost inside. Subscribe to the channel to continue this journey with Rumi. And above all, do not run from the question that remained alive in your chest after all of this.